Welcome to Atheists Speak Up. I'm Steve Whitty, and our guest today is Rene Lichtman. Welcome to the show, Rene.
Thank you.
So, Rene, you've got an interesting background. You were born in Europe. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Okay. I was born in Paris, France. Both my mother and father were immigrants, since we're talking about immigrants and immigration and foreigners, etc. So they were both immigrants from Poland, and in the mid-30s they both left Poland to go to Paris. Exactly why, it's not clear, but usually the motivation was the same type of motivation that people have today, which is for maybe economic reasons and maybe a better, a freer environment. France was seen by many people as an egalitarian society, a democratic society, the same way the United States is seen by many others. And I was born in Paris in 1937. So think of Poland being invaded in 39, and I was a couple years old, 2 years old, and then 1940 was when France was invaded. And my father joined, I'll give you a short version, joined the French army as a young Jewish immigrant. Many immigrants joined the French army at that time, and he was killed in combat. Fortunately for me, I was put with a Catholic, I should say a non-Jewish family outside of Paris. They said they were Catholic, but I think they were really communists. But they were atheists. But we had crosses around the house, and I spent the war years in hiding there, and my mother survived.
Yeah.
And then I came again as an immigrant to the United States at the age of 13.
Yeah. And so by in hiding, you really mean that you didn't really leave the house. That was, I mean, it was really in hiding.
Yeah, it really means physically hiding, which was the safest thing that you could do. If you think of the Anne Frank story.
That's right.
She was a couple years older than me, but in my situation, I was hidden as with no other kids, with a little farming. It's a little town which is still there, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I maybe go into my details a little bit in terms of parallels between what I experienced as a young person in France under fascism, and what I've experienced recently with the Trump administration coming in.
Here in the U.S.
In the U.S., yes. Because I think there's a few very dramatic examples of the parallels between the two that I could talk about.
So this is really a heads up for our audience.
I think
perhaps.
So.
Yeah.
I think so. And when I first heard about Trump, especially Steve Bannon, I remember being in certain places and people say, "What do you think of the elections?" And I would say, "Well, you know, for me, this is like neo-fascism. It's like, you know, Germany in the early 20s, when there was a kind of, scapegoating of Muslims, in this case, or the Hispanic community, finding the scapegoat, and, a lot of racism and things like that. The early period of Hitler, of the fascist regime in Germany. Yeah, that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah. So we can get right into that if you.
Okay. So one of the examples was I started working in communities where people were beginning to get picked up by ICE in the Detroit area. So that meant the Muslim community, which is very large in Dearborn especially, but all over the Detroit area, and the Hispanic community, especially places like Pontiac, which is very interesting because Pontiac, it's almost like it's not been well known that ICE was really picking up a lot of people. So I will, when I noticed that, I spoke about it, and I was invited to speak at the Capitol in Lansing. There was a bill that was being
Considered.
debated,
Yeah.
and Jeremy Morse, I think, was one of the people that helped invite me, and I spoke about my feelings of that experience. And so what I talked about was this photograph, and I said that this is a photograph taken during what's called the roundups, right, in France or all over Europe, all over occupied Germany, or the Germans call them Aktion. Aktion, and in this case, it means the Germans deputizing the local police, French police, and using them to do the dirty work. Because the Germans, and they were very smart, you know, in a kind of evil way, they were very slick. Not all of them spoke French, although they loved France, they loved French women, you know, French wine, etc., etc. If you saw The Grand Illusion, this famous film, they hung out in the same brothels, you know, before the war, etc. But anyway, so they used the French police. So this shows the French police rounding up a group of Jewish men, and where do these Jewish men live? How did the Germans know, or the French police? Well, you had to register. You had to register, and you get an ID card, etc. And there were these lists of where the Jews lived. The French police had access to these lists in the same way that our own authorities, the local authorities, have access to where people live, right? ICE doesn't know that, and they don't care. They'll demand that you provide those lists with it. So here they are going to this building where there's Jews living in this building, and they round him up, they bring him down, and they're putting them on a bus. Now this is a traditional French bus that I remember as a kid. They put him on this bus, and the French police are doing all of this with a few Germans. There's a few Germans around there just kind of supervising, but the French are doing that. And since then, the French police have, you know, admitted their guilt in that process. They feel very bad about that, and they try to do
reparations,
and you know, help in that process of memorializing what happened. Now, and I talked about this in front of these Congress people, and I said, this is what ICE has been doing, and one of the demands that we have as part of indivisible groups, which is to go to our local sheriff or police and say, please don't cooperate. You don't have to cooperate with ICE. They want to use you. And if they come, you know, let them do their own work. There's nothing that says legally you have to turn somebody in because they have a light bulb that's out, or they have a little crack in the windshield. Don't call ICE for that, please. And some of these people, you know, it's part of the whole sanctuary movement. And some of these professional police officers have agreed. They said, that's right. No, legally, we just do our job. They can do their job. We're not going to turn people in. Some of them do turn these immigrants in. So I talked about that. And sure enough, in the next few days after that, I noticed there was a big roundup in Detroit, and this was on the east side, in the middle of the night. And this is from a video, which, again, it's not very clear because it was somebody shot it with a cell phone, and then they put it on I guess, on Facebook, and then I took a picture of this. So this is a bus. It looks like a city bus or rental bus, rounding up, in this case, not Muslims or Hispanics, but Chaldean Christians in Detroit who are from the Middle East, from Iraq. They're like original Christians from Iraq. So they're Chaldeans. and they're a small, very oppressed minority under Saddam Hussein, and a lot of them came to Detroit, and they've been very welcomed in Detroit, and they have good jobs. They manage a lot of gas stations and little party stores, etc., etc. The Chaldean community, and they're Christians. So here, for some strange reason, ICE gets the order to round up these people who are very conservative people and who voted for Trump.
At least the majority of them did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as soon as they heard that their own people, they just couldn't believe it, you know. And so here they are, being rounded up, and young people hearing about it, I guess through Facebook, etc., going there trying to protest, to no avail. We had no idea where they were going to be shipped, in the same way that when this happened in France, you never knew where
You
it was.
didn't know where they were
Right.
going to be taken.
In this case, eventually, we found out that they were shipped to Youngstown, Ohio, and they're still there. Over 120 are still sitting there. They haven't been sent back to Iraq because it would be like a death sentence. They've always been seen as, you know, not patriotic enough, and they're not Muslims, they're Christians, etc., etc. So that's what's happening in terms of ICE with the local police. There was an interesting part of my presentation where it reminded me of when I was in the U.S. Army, and I told this story because I joined the Army at one point, and at one point I worked in a unit. We did a lot of training. This was in Fort Riley, Kansas, and at one point my commanding officer, who was a young captain from West Point, very bright guy, and he calls me and he says, Lichtman, he says, I have a list of immigrants here, of foreigners, of non-citizens in our units, and your name is on this list. And you know, this is an intelligence unit, which
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really that aware of it. We were a training unit. We did a lot of basic training and all kinds of artillery, so maybe there was. And so he said, yeah, your name, that means you're not a citizen. You shouldn't be in this unit. Do you have any papers? And I said, well, no, sir, because when I came here, I was under the age of 16, which I think still applies. And my mother married an American citizen, and so we assumed that, we were told that I would be automatically a citizen because of my mother, marrying this gentleman, and I was under 16. And he said, well, that's not the case. He says, you need some papers, so go into town and go see Judge so-and-so and swear, and I'll take somebody with you as a witness and do that. So I do that, and I said to these people who were, in Lansing, I said, you know what, when I think about it in retrospect, if it had been today, what if the Kermit W. Bell III was his name? If Captain Bell had called ICE
Instead,
yeah. and on this immigrant or whatever, illegal, I don't know where they would have shipped me back to what, France or something? Anyway, it's a little bit of a personal, where I feel some parallel, some empathy with what's going on now.
Sure. Yeah, the way that I look at it, most of us are immigrants in some sense. I'm fifth generation American, but that's only 5 generations. I don't think of that as particularly long. 1800s, late 1800s at that. Would that be my great-great-grandfather came over and settled in northern Michigan. And then 10 years later, he actually brings his family over. He's made enough money to bring his family over. And that's why I'm here, apparently. So in some ways, that has nothing to do with me, right? That was 5 generations ago. I don't even know these people. my grandfather, as far as the farthest back that I actually remember meeting. So there's 2 generations that I never met. But that doesn't mean that I'm really any different from somebody who came off the boat themselves. Not really. I mean, I was born here, and the Constitution says that that makes a difference. But yeah, I can absolutely see it. To me, the Native Americans have been here for 10,000 years longer.
Let me, point out something again from my own experience in terms of the roundups, which is what happened in my neighborhood in Paris when these roundups occurred. So I was in hiding with this family in the just outside of Paris, maybe 1 hour away, and meanwhile my mother, who was now a widow, although she didn't know it, but my father had been killed right away, so she stayed in hiding. She stayed in our apartment in Paris, and which is still there, and I've visited a couple times. So this is a photograph from the apartment where we lived, and what the Germans did during that action, that you saw the pictures of it, especially on July 16th, 1942. It was going to be a big roundup, and everybody knew about it. That means non-Jewish people as well. And one of our neighbors, very important, and I hope it happens in the United States also with immigrants. I think it is, the whole concept of sanctuaries. One of our neighbors came to my mother and said, "We know the Germans are coming for you in the next few days, and we have a hiding place for you." And my mother believed, and my mother was one of these immigrants. She couldn't speak French. She spoke Yiddish.
And presumably Polish.
No.
No, not even Polish.
No, not Polish,
wow.
because
Yiddish.
In those days, you were a minority, a nation, or you were a Jewish nation or Jewish people or whatever, and you spoke your language, and you had a ghetto and etc. And you went to your own schools, which those communities liked. So you really didn't, unless you did trade, unless business with Polish people, like the marketplace, so you knew enough Polish to get around. But she spoke mostly Yiddish. So she goes up there. Now I showed the photograph. What they did on my street is they came, and again they had the lists from the French police, the same way that ICE would get the lists from local authorities, right? And they would barricade these streets with buses and trucks, and then just go building by building. This is what they did, and bring those Jews down. And they came to our building, came up to the 3rd floor where my mother lived, and there were other Jews in the building as well. And they broke the door down because she wasn't there. And they went inside, they took out her sewing machines, furniture, etc., and barricaded the door. When they left, and my mother remained in hiding for the remaining 2 years of the war, with the help of these non-Jewish neighbors.
Providing sanctuary.
Providing sanctuary, again, the parallel. And of course, I was hiding in a different place, so I didn't know, and I didn't see her, and it created a lot of, in terms of identity, I didn't know who she was when she did come to pick me up. But since then, I've been able to find all of these Jewish people from that street who were picked up, whom I didn't know, young people, and I have photographs of them, etc., etc. And so this stuff is not abstract, it's very concrete. Today, as we speak in France, and I'm going to one of these events very soon, there are plaques in all of these buildings. The French government, with the help of the French police, have put up plaques where all of these young children and family members were taken from this school or this building, etc., to commemorate, and it's a very, concrete, you might say, experience for them in Europe, different than what we've experienced here. But now we have this experience with which is pretty, I think, pretty new for us. The fact that neighbors are being just picked up and sent off because they happen to be different.
Yeah. And there's no rhyme or reason which groups they've picked. I mean, again, this is a group here in Detroit that probably voted for the current leadership.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I did want
what rhyme or reason is there?
Yeah, I did want to just mention those other parallels that I saw, that I remember from the Germans and from the Trump administration. The whole concept of a scapegoat.
Right.
So in Germany, Hitler was very, very good about blaming someone for the terrible economic conditions, et cetera, et cetera.
We'd had the Great Depression starting in 1929.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just in the U.S. where it started, it spread worldwide.
Right. And in addition, they lost World War I, and Hitler's summary was they were stabbed in the back by the Jews. It's like, really? Somehow the Jews of the German Jews who fought on the German side, because they were German patriots, they were very German, the Jews, and he blamed them, and he blamed the Jews of on Wall Street, and he blamed the Jews for starting communism, the Bolsheviks. So that was the target, and it worked. Most people agreed with him, and what Trump has done is he's got also his favorite people that he blames. It's either the Muslims or the Hispanics.
Yeah. In many cases today, we have Wikipedia, we have Snopes, we have other sorts of ways of fact-checking. And there has been quite a bit of effort at discrediting the fact-checking sources, or at least the major ones, as well as discrediting the major media. And yet, major media is also it's being used as part of the propaganda machine. So that's actually kind of got to be a funny relationship as well. But the parallels are there. Hitler also tried to discredit the newspapers and so on.
Right, and so, Hitler had an expression, and it wasn't just the Nazis, but the communists also used that. At times, it was the term cosmopolitan. Now, Miller, I'm not sure if his name is Steve Miller or not the Steve Miller Band, but Miller, who's a buddy of Bannon, used that expression at one point. He was at a news conference and he talked about cosmopolitan. So cosmopolitan means what you were talking about, the media elite, or the cultural elite. You heard of the culture wars. So that would mean on the East Coast, the culture of the opera or the theater or music, which really is different than what people experience, let's say, in Ohio or Kentucky or Michigan in the auto factories, etc. It's a different world. It's part of that culture war type of thing. So Miller used the expression cosmopolitan. Usually it was followed by the cosmopolitan Jew. That was
Right.
the scapegoat. And I see that parallel between the working class, white, stiff, and also with that sense of victimhoods. Hitler
Right.
did that all the time. You German Volk, the little people, you're the victim. And of course.
And here's a likely culprit.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yes.
In the culture wars, the poorest of the population have often been handed a scapegoat. It might be the blacks over history, especially since the Civil War, but it might be another group. Over time, that has been a standard technique. So I see that certainly taking place here. I don't think we would have racism if we didn't have the real class struggle, where you have the people who really do have the money and the influence, and people who basically just try to work for a living. Most people, they just live and let live. But we have quite a bit of propaganda that has maintained racism and propped it up over the years.
Yes, I would agree with you, and that's in terms of the history of the Detroit area and black workers coming from the South and Ford using black labor, and of course creating tension between those the black and white. And one of the positive things about the unions is they try to
join people together.
Join people together. At the same time, they weren't. There was a certain degree of racism. But you're absolutely right. I think the question of blacks and labor and being the scapegoat, etc. That's always jangled. I'll never forget when George Wallace came out.
We're just about out of time.
Okay.
It has been absolutely great having you on the show.
Thank you.
Rene, it was a great topic. It speaks to today, certainly.
Yes, to be continued, yes.
We'd like to have you back, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so Rene Lichtman, this has been Atheists Speak Up.